Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast. I'm your host, John Slickbaum, and today we're talking about acquisitions, strategic offsets, and aircraft production. Now, I know this may sound boring, but we are taking a different approach to this discussion today. We'll take a look at these specific topics through the lens of fighter jets, from the Century series of the 1950s to stealth aircraft of today. We'll be talking about the important strategic trends, acquisition decisions, and how they combine to shape the defense industry. But most importantly, we'll be talking about cool airplanes. From the F-100 Super Sabre to the F-106 Delta Dart, the Century series fighters revolutionized the Air Force fighter force in an era when a response to the Soviet threat demanded new capabilities. The Century series were the first operationally supersonic fighters in the Air Force, and they were relatively complex weapon systems. For example, the F-106 had a radar, missiles, a computer data link, and could even be remotely flown from a ground station. What is most amazing about the period of the 1950s is the pace at which the Air Force and the industrial base developed these new designs. In the span of a decade, 6 types were fielded, and new models were fast to follow. On average, it took about 5 years to go from contract award to initial operational capability. That's an incredible pace of innovation, development, and production. It's a stark difference from today. You've heard us say this often on the Aerospace Advantage podcast. Today's Air Force is the oldest and smallest that it's ever been. The Air Force's fighter aircraft, for example, average nearly 30 years of age. They're what we call fourth generation or legacy fighters that were designed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The F-15, A-10, and F-16 is really what we're talking about here. Now, if these jets were cars, they'd have antique license plates on them today. The problem with these legacy fighters, which comprise roughly 80% of the Air Force fighter fleet, is not just that they're old, but the very nature of the design makes them irrelevant for the kinds of high-end peer conflicts that our nation must prepare for. I think the public is growing to realize what a threat to our interests and our way of life China is becoming. And although no one wishes for a war with China, our military must be properly equipped to shape the situation to enable diplomacy, deter any potential aggression, and, if necessary, fight to win. These legacy fighters were designed to compete against the Soviet Union of the 1980s, not the China of today or the China of the future. If our men and women go to war in these older jets, we're essentially sending them off to die. Now, I know that sounds really dramatic, but that is the nature and reality of air combat. Only 20% of the Air Force's fighter fleet is survivable in these scenarios today. Specifically, we're talking about the F-22 and the F-35. Yet these aircraft took nearly 15 years to develop. We won't have that luxury of time to develop a new aircraft. So what's changed? Why could the Air Force and aerospace defense industry be so fast and innovative in the 1950s and so slow today? That's what we're going to talk about. One of our Mitchell Institute fellows, Heather Penney, recently did a deep dive into these issues, and she's here to talk with us today about what we can learn from the past fighters to help the Air Force accelerate the transformation of its fighter fleet. Well, Heather, thank you for being here today.
Slick, as always, it's great to be here, and thanks for having me on.
Well, Lucky, you just released a big report on the defense industrial base, and I have to admit, it does sound like really dry stuff. So what got you interested in this issue?
So we embarked on this study as a result of the work that we've done with DARPA on future warfare, peer competition, and force structure, at a time when the Air Force is the oldest and the smallest that it's ever been. So the mismatch between the force that we have, the force that we need, and the industrial base that both rely upon is one that must be reconciled if we're going to compete, deter, and win in any peer conflict. So we took a historical approach to exploring this problem, its causes, contributing factors, so that we could identify high potential solutions.
All right, so with that, what did you find?
Yeah, so what we found was that the force structure in the business models of today's aerospace defense industrial base is not configured to invent, develop, or deliver the force the future needs, and certainly not at the pace that a technological peer adversary will demand. So this is not the fault of the defense industry. As a monopsony system, and that's where there's only one customer for a number of different vendors, which is really unlike what as consumers we're used to. As a monopsony system, defense companies have only one customer, the Department of Defense. So they have to optimize their corporations and their business models to the Defense Department's buying behavior.
All right. So how did you measure the ability of the industrial base to deliver capabilities?
We looked at fighters from the 1950s to today and how long it took from contract award to field, and we looked at the history of their acquisition programs. And we did not include any pre-award development or prototype, although we considered that. We didn't use that in our timeline to measure how quickly they could deliver capability. The average contract to field time for these fighters is 5 years. And that's from the 1950s, basically up until the 1990s. The F-15, which arguably was the most sophisticated fighter of its time, was a paper contract, so it had no experimental prototype. And it took only 7 years to field. That's really a testament to the experience and the expertise of McDonnell's design team. What we found was design team experience was crucial to enabling rapid problem solving. Furthermore, the F-15 was a single mission aircraft. As you'll remember, Slick, its motto was not a pound for air to ground. And
Sure.
this enabled the engineers to make smart design trade-off choices. We found that elements like this, as we looked at the historical case studies of each of these fighters, really gave us insight into lessons learned that we could apply today. Another example is the F-106. So that was a fighter in the 1950s, was designed to be a supersonic interceptor to intercept nuclear bombers from the Soviet Union. And it stands out for its 9-year developmental period. So what was going on here, frankly, was technological overreach. Convair, which was the company that designed and built the F-106 and its predecessor, the F-102, had to solve significant aerodynamic problems like transonic drag. I know that's kind of creepy, but it's that airspeed between 0.9 to 1.3 Mach that really has a lot of drag on it. So they had to solve those aerodynamic problems as well as advanced technological requirements. So remember me saying that the F-106 was supposed to be a supersonic interceptor to intercept supersonic Soviet nuclear bombers? The F-106 was remotely flown via a data link from a ground station computer until the radar on the F-106 could pick up and complete the intercept. This is the 1950s. So they're doing this with, vacuum ray tubes, right?
Yeah, that's pretty incredible.
Exactly. And so it was the F-106. Remember I said that the F-102 was its predecessor, actually began as the F-102. But the program had so many issues that the Air Force fielded basically a minimum viable product as the F-102, and as it continued to develop the 106. But by the time the F-106 became operational, nearly a decade after initial contract award, the service had actually already filled those capability gaps with the F-101 and the Beaumark interceptor missile system. So it's important to note that the F-106 was overcome by events because the competition had shifted from nuclear bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles. So not only had the capability gaps been filled, but the whole nature of the competition shifted. So the lesson here was clear. Longer developmental timeframes risk irrelevance.
So Heather, is this where the train starts coming off the tracks?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't start coming off the tracks there because you'll see that the fighter fielding timelines actually gets shorter again. And a lot of that has to do with how the service leaders in the Air Force really sort of re-envisioned the kinds of fighters that they wanted to buy in the late 60s and early 70s. So you see, for example, we already talked about the F-15. That was, yes, very technologically advanced, so we can kind of compare what they were trying to do with the F-15 with what they were trying to do with the F-106. But what they did there also was they really, again, made very clear design choices for their engineering teams so that they could be focused on what challenges they needed to pursue and what they would cut from the design. What we see with the F-16, again, super fast in terms of the delivery. That's they really can say that because they scoped their technical reach down to advanced maneuverability and affordability, that was a main reason why they were able to field it so quickly. So we see the approaches that the service has to the actual aircraft having a significant impact on how quickly they can field. So the F-117 is another great example of this. So we think of that stealth fighter as an icon for the second offset. Because the Stealth 117 employed precision weapons. It only took 5 years to field. And similar to the F-16, it was the result of a robust experimental prototyping program. But It was also the experience of the engineers and the clear design focus of the program that enabled us to be able to field such revolutionary capability so quickly. What's notable is when you take a look at our modern fighters, the F-22 and the F-35, is we see suddenly a tripling of developmental timeframes. So 14 years for the F-22 to go from contract award to fielding, and 15 years for the F-35. And both of these programs had pre-contract prototypes. So while we should consider all the factors that we just discussed, another point really stands out. By the 1990s, we're only procuring one aircraft per decade. And if you consider the strike eagle as not really a new start, we can kind of look at the 1980s as skipping a design. I mean, we remember the Reagan era as being a big defense buildup, but what Reagan actually did was buy the aircraft that were already in production. So he did a massive turnover of the fleet, and that's when we finally divest all of the Century Series fighters, those fighters that were developed in the 1950s. And really bring on the fourth gen that's actually still the backbone of today. As I said, the fourth generation legacy fighters, they were all developed in the 1970s. And nearly 15 years passed before the F-22 is put on contract in 1991. And then it's a decade before you get the Joint Strike Fighter on contract in 2001. So, if we look back to the F-35, it's already been 20 years with no new fighter competition. And it may be another 10 before NGAD's awarded. We're not really sure because there's not a lot of clarity into that program. So we could conceivably go 30 years without any new design competition or experience, and we already know that we've gone 20. So this has had a very deleterious impact on the experience and the expertise of the design teams and engineers to be able to rapidly innovate and solve those problems and field things quickly. It's just like being an athlete. It's about the reps. Right? So the issues that trouble Air Force acquisition today, those high unit costs, aggressive award protests, cost overruns, extended developmental cycles, growing sustainment costs, I would argue that these are largely the result of Air Force buying behavior and the impacts of the Department of Defense and how they have made programs like the F-22, the B-2, and the F-35. They've introduced instability into the program from a bureaucratic standpoint. And all of that has negative consequences for our ability to field the force that we need.
One of the things that's blowing my mind here is you're just talking about from the actual contract award to the production, happening at a deliverable pace. We're not even talking about the buildup to design the requirements that lead into the contract award, which can take, as I know, having been a requirements officer, 15 to 20 years before the contract even comes out. So yeah, like you said, this is like a 30 to 35 year process, really, when the Air Force says we have a new idea of what we need, start building it out. So this seems like, a problem that the Air Force would want to completely avoid. So how did we get into this mess?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, today we have all these bureaucratic processes to define the requirements and so forth. And as you mentioned, that can take 5 to 10, even sometimes 15 years to negotiate. I will say this, that just as a quick insert, again, from historical case studies, both the F-16 and the F-117 were the results of a competitive experimental prototype program where they were exploring specific problems that they believed would be advantages, combat advantages. And so this was a way for them to rapidly sort of circumvent that requirements type process, very similar in a way that that DARPA technologies can do today. But it's not really how we typically approach acquisition. We really approach acquisition from this, very static, very bureaucratic type process. But, you asked, how did we get stuck in this? And, we kind of got started, as most messes do, through good intentions. And in this case, a lot of this bureaucracy and a lot of these paradigms came about by becoming myopically focused on the second offset approach of quality over quantity, right? So, for our listeners, offset strategies seek to identify and exploit attributes of unique advantage against the adversary. So instead of competing tit for tat, an offset will shift the competition to an area of adversary weakness, like where we think the adversary cannot compete, right? So, for example, the first offset, Eisenhower's New Look Force, focused on nuclear weapons as a means to deter, compete, and win against the Soviet Union. We just didn't think the Soviets could match our nuclear capabilities. When they did, much to our surprise, it upset our strategy and turned it into a symmetric competition, counting missiles and counting bombers, right? So we're competing in the same space. Ironically, it was Vietnam that led to the second offset. Fighting against Soviet equipment and tactics in that proxy conflict gave us insights into our shortfalls. With a smaller force, because we knew that the Soviets had industrial mass on their side, we had to seek a means to make our force more effective. And the answer to that was in advanced capabilities. So stealth, precision weapons, navigation and timing, advanced sensing and processing. We believe that these would be true force multipliers. And this advantage turned out to be enduring not only because of the quality and innovation of U.S. technology at the time, but also because of the structure of the Soviet industrial base. The communist system of centralized industrial planning, their scale, and frankly, the poor education and skill of their workforce, they simply could not pivot to compete. So we see Desert Storm proving this hypothesis of the second offset, that against one of the most sophisticated air defense systems and the second largest standing army in the world, we actually were, from a force size, at the disadvantage. We were much smaller than the Iraqi forces, and we found that smaller could indeed be better.
Well, isn't this what we've been talking against, though, saying that we have the smallest Air Force that we've ever had?
Yeah, no, we've actually, you're right. We've become a victim of our own success. So remember, the second offset was intended to compensate for having a smaller force, not to justify cutting it. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, this is exactly what happened, right? The defense leaders believed that by pursuing ever more advanced and sophisticated capabilities, they could achieve cost savings by cutting force structure. And we're coming out of the 80s, out of the Reagan era buildup. People are hungry to kind of save money. We don't feel that real threat from the Soviet Union anymore. And so they really are demanding a defense savings, right? They want that peace dividend. But this dynamic of getting better so that we can get smaller using those advanced capabilities to justify cutting force structure, it's actually created its own problem, where the increased sophistication of individual weapon systems drives up unit costs, which means that less can be procured. So it becomes this vicious cycle. For too long, senior defense leadership has focused on using these advanced capabilities as a means to cut force structure. This approach has neglected the other attributes available to achieve strategic offset. And this approach is not going to be able to deliver the future force design needed to compete against a peer adversary. We know that the quality of the force and these advanced capabilities will still matter against a technologically advanced adversary. We're not arguing that we need to be more like the Soviets, right? But we need to consider how to deliberately dial up other force attributes of quantity, diversity, and complexity in our force, right? Importantly, against a technological peer like China, we can't assume that we're smarter and better than them, that our technology is always going to be superior. So adaptation and speed will be what provides that combat advantage. Time now is the new offset. But because of the history of how we got here, the defense industry is not structured to develop and deliver this kind of force.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think about, obviously, as you're talking here. Yes, more capabilities equal that we may be able to have less quantity, but especially when you're going up against China, that's going to have numbers. We're going to have to be able to answer. And one of the things I want to say too is, speaking about the Raptor, which is just an amazing airplane. I flew alongside it. I got to be part of it at the weapons school as the initial cadre came online, and just watching it fly and what it could do in the airspace is just eye-watering, and it obviously is able to crush the adversaries in training anywhere it goes. So you can't tell me that going into design and development to have these robust capabilities isn't a bad thing, right?
No, you're right. The F-22 is an awesome jet. I mean, truly is the best fighter in the world. And like you, I fought against the Raptor, and they were totally invisible until they were right on top of you. I mean, we were dead before we knew it, right? But the F-22 took 14 years to field, and that was after having a prototype. So the problem is that time is the new offset. If we take that long in the future to develop and field something, the operational context will have changed so much that it's likely that a new plane may be obsolete. I mean, you just have to think about the F-106, right? Game-changing technology in the really revolutionary way that we like to think of it, especially when we want to put every game-changing thing on that one aircraft, that's going to take a long time to invent, integrate, and field. And high-cost platforms mean that we can't buy as many as we need. And we also believe now that we need to neck down how many types we have, right? We've heard the chief say we're going to go from 7 fighters to 4. So taken together, these small fleets and the decrease in complexity of the force compositions that we're putting forward, that limits our operations both in theater and globally. And it also makes our operations really predictable to adversaries. And when you think about this as well, when you have such a small force, when there's so few of them, but each one is so advanced and they're so expensive, and we can't replace them because we don't have a hot production line, we can't afford to lose any. So we put ourselves in the square corner where we have these incredible capabilities, but we don't have enough to make them practically utilitarian, and we can't afford to lose them. And it takes so long to invent something new. I mean, together, all of this is a recipe for losing. But it's a structure that the Defense Department has imposed upon the defense industry because defense leaders persist in believing that myth that we can continue to get smaller but better. And we
No,
get
I
better to
totally
get
see where
smaller.
you're going with this, right? It's just like a vicious cycle. As we have increased capabilities, we justify reducing the capacity. And obviously, the issue is the warfighter isn't going to get what they need in time or in the quantities that they need. So how does this tie into what's going on with the industrial base?
Yeah, so offset theory has shaped the defense industry through diminished competition. Remember the Last Supper in 1993? So you have Secretary of Defense William Perry getting together the CEOs of the major defense companies and basically saying, look, I'm not going to have enough competitions to feed you all, and some of you are going to go out of business, and we're going to stand by and let that happen. So you see from 1993 to just 15 years later in 2007, over 30 defense companies consolidated down into 5 primes.
Heather, I'm sorry, let me stop you for a second. Can you tell us what primes are in the industrial base?
Yeah, so prime contractors, those are the big companies that are generally the lead for any new competition. And so part of what's gone on is the lack of competition has forced companies to either be acquired by the prime companies, which we also in the business refer to as majors. So primes and majors are they're pretty much the same thing. It's synonymous. Or they've really been relegated to subs. So in the Air Force, we think of our primes really as being our major aircraft companies, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman. And then their subcontractors could either be their partners who are subcontractors in the business, same way you'd have a general contractor for building your house, and he would have subs that would do the electrical and the plumbing and so forth. Kind of the same thing for aircraft development, right? You're going to have a prime contractor who does all of the integration. They're the people who are going to be really working with the Air Force, and they're going to have subcontractors and then sub-tier suppliers that actually get down to the mom and pop shops of who forges the bulkheads, who's actually building the wiring harnesses, and even sub-tier contractors who build things like, components for radars and sensors. So that's really kind of what the ecosystem looks like. And so today, when we think of the major aircraft production houses for the Air Force, you've got Lockheed Martin produces fighters, you've got Boeing, which basically produces heavy airlift, and you've got Northrop Grumman, right, which is producing the bomber. So we really, we really don't have the diversity within the industrial base that we used to. In the 1950s, the Air Force had 19 credible fighter production companies, and now we have 1, maybe 2. So lack of competition didn't just force consolidation of the defense industry. It also decreased design creativity and diversity, the engineering experience, and the manufacturing skills of our industry. So we're fundamentally losing our ability to innovate because we're not holding competitions and we don't have robust experimental prototype programs like we did in the past. And we mentioned the F-22. The government has been a poor partner to industry. I mean, the F-22 experienced a tremendous amount of bureaucratic, programmatic instability that really drove a tremendous amount of time into that schedule and made everything much more expensive. I mean, you think about the F-22. Originally, the requirement was for 750 aircraft, and then it was for 442 aircraft, and then the requirement was for 381 aircraft, and then ultimately production was prematurely terminated at 187. I mean, originally the rate was going to be up to 75, and the highest rate of production for the F-22 was only 36, but on average it was 24. So you can see how the instability from the government side really inserts a lot of cost and time, and it makes planning and program execution really difficult for industry. And finally, the scarcity of new starts. And by new starts, I mean new start competitions. The Air Force is going to build an entirely new aircraft. So implies the entire new design, development, and production, right? The scarcity of these new start competitions means that nearly every single one is virtually existential for companies. Inevitable protests, because the losers are going to need to protest, is going to delay work, it's going to increase costs to the government, and increase the instability of the program overall. So I mentioned Secretary Bill Perry earlier with the Last Supper, and it's worth emphasizing that he later expressed regret for what they did and the policy that the department had, because the overhead savings, the cost efficiencies, the lower unit and program costs that he expected from that contraction never actually materialized. And he recognized the adverse consequences on the force, on the military, noting that what we got was a few large companies, but less effective competition. And this is a quote: "We would have been better off with more smaller firms than with a few large ones."
Well, we're seeing that in other areas of aerospace with pop-up companies as startups being able to compete with things, consider SpaceX, for example. But going back to your point, it's a pretty telling statement of this regret and how the scarcity has really caused a new start competition issue within the defense industry. So can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. But I'd like to pick up on that first thread that you brought up regarding new companies and how do we begin to expand this. And I'll get back to this later on in our conversation. But what's really exciting is that eras of rapid technological advancement, like hypersonics, like the expansion into space, and so forth, that can actually enable new entrants. So we're actually in an era where the Defense Department and the Air Force can increase the number of credible primes that it has by exploiting this new era of technology, autonomous systems, unmanned systems, things like that. So again, like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that offers us a credible opportunity. Regarding how the scarcity of these new start competitions have impacted it, without new starts, industry's really shifted away from development, design, production, and integration. I mean, the big primes, because they're really managing, first of all, their partners, because that's now their new competition strategy. They have to have partners in order to be able to win those few competitions that come around. And they have all these subs. They're focusing their engineering expertise on integration. And integration is not in and of itself a bad thing, right? I mean, it's crucial to being able to mate both the physical design of the aircraft and the software designs of its sensors and avionics, and enables modernization of existing aircraft. But the problem is that the industry's expertise is imbalanced. The force can only get so far, it can only be adapted so far through modernization and integration, because we need to remember that especially with the force we have right now, we're limited by those legacy platforms. Integration isn't going to be enough to make an A-10, capable in a high-end peer threat environment, right? We still need that experience and expertise to design new weapon systems to solve the traditional physical problems of the battle space. So when we look at China, we don't really have the range, the speeds, the altitudes, the payloads, and then you think about maneuverability and endurance, including the physical sensor requirements of the mission. People think you can just slap a sensor onto anything, but especially in an era where stealth is the cost of entry to the modern battle space, we need to begin thinking differently about, airplanes aren't just simply trucks. They really do need to have the diversity to solve those physical problem sets of the battle space. And now, since we know that information and sensors are so crucial to maintaining that advantage, size, weight, power, and cooling, SWaP-C, right? Those are actually physical attributes that need to be designed into the aircraft. So if we're thinking about, for example, laser weapons, do we actually have the power generation from the engines necessary to power those lasers? Can we cool all the avionics? So these are issues that are going to drive new aircraft designs. We're not at a point where we've figured all of that out, right? And we also know that integration alone is not going to be able to overcome the limitations of our legacy platforms. We need these new designs.
Yeah, and I just think about I've lived in an era where I had old jets getting modernized with new software and new things that could be put onto the airplanes, and I never really thought about tech this way. So, how else is the Air Force's buying power or behavior shaping industry?
Yeah, so to me, this is kind of the most troubling, right? So let me start with a few numbers for you to describe just how drastic the lack of production opportunities is. In 1955, that era of the Century series, at its highest, the Air Force was procuring 2,700 fighters a year. That's more than the Air Force's total fighter inventory today. We only have roughly 2,000 fighters in the Air Force Reserves, and the Air National Guard. In fiscal year 22, the Air Force procured less than 50 aircraft. When we look at the budget docs, and the Navy has actually bought more aircraft than the Air Force has for nearly 20 years. If you ask me, there's something wrong with that.
Sure.
I'm not suggesting we return to 2,700 fighters a year, but where we're at is destructive to both the Air Force and the industry. When we don't buy new production, when we don't have new competitions, this moves industry business lines away from R&D and production and into sustainment. Given how unreliable the department has been regarding new starts and production, and again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but you think about it, only 21 of 132 B-2s were procured. The F-22 is prematurely terminated at 187 of the original 750 buy, and we're already seeing weakening support for the F-35, which really concerns me. We have got to surge production on that platform. When industry takes a look at the lay of the land, they realize sustainment is a far more reliable and lucrative business line for industry and for their investors.
Heather, I hadn't thought about sustainment being the prime profit center, thinking, they'd want to develop more airplanes and sell more airplanes, but obviously keeping them, the ones going that we have, is where they're going to really make a lot of money. It's a really interesting take. But so how does this really impact our ability to compete against China then?
Well, we're incentivizing industry to sustain the past rather than inventing the future, right? These trends are all problematic to strategic security challenges that our nation faces today because, to be blunt, the defense industry is not structured or incentivized to field the force design required by a new offset. It simply cannot deliver capacity or diversity at speed. The Soviet Union kind of offers a cautionary tale to the challenge we face today in the United States. The Soviets simply could not compete against the U.S.'s advanced technologies, which relied upon electronics and processors. And of course, we had stealth and all that, but to develop stealth, we needed those electronics and processors and so forth, and precision and advanced navigation and timing and all of those things. And it wasn't that the Soviets weren't smart. The issue there was structural. Their industrial model simply couldn't keep pace or outpace the rapid American military technical revolution. The Soviet theory of victory relied upon industrial might. And because they were centrally controlled as a communist structure, they were unable to transition their bureaucracies or their industrial base. The American shift into information left the Soviet military-industrial complex unable to compete. So this isn't the fault of our defense industry that we're in this position today. It's the result of the persisting belief that to achieve affordability, we have to get smaller by pursuing ever more advanced technology consolidated on sophisticated systems. This decreases competition opportunities, and it's really only exacerbated by unstable government behavior. And I'd like to say this. Acquisition reform, although, trying to tackle these, just the knots of bureaucratic regulations and processes, acquisition reform is unlikely to make any major changes to the structures and incentives of the defense industrial base. Nor is acquisition reform likely to accelerate the fielding of new capabilities, because the problem here isn't policy or regulation, although those are definitely issues here. The problem is paradigm.
Yeah, and I hate to say that your couple comments brought me back to like eighth grade social studies of understanding the fall of the Soviet Union was they were wrapped into unwinnable war in Afghanistan, and they were trying to keep pace from an industrial standpoint with the United States, and we just broke them from a financial standpoint. So thinking about our own military and the acquisition process that takes decades just really blows my mind, especially when we think about China and have to focus there, and we consider them a pacing threat, and we just can't afford to get left behind like the Soviets did. So how are we going to fix this?
Yeah, it's a little bit of deja vu, right? This might sound trite, but if we want more competition, we need to hold more competitions. So history shows us the way. The Air Force can actually use normal market dynamics to reshape industry into one that can compete successfully against China and meet the nation's air power needs across the entire range of security requirements around the globe. A larger defense base means more competition, increased innovation, and greater design diversity. It can provide the nation's strategic depth of capability by cultivating seasoned talent and experience. And remember, I worked in the industrial base. I know those guys, we have some incredible talent there, but we need to build it, cultivate it, and unleash it. One thing is we need to ensure that we avoid future joint aircraft programs. We know through history, and there have been a number of joint aircraft development programs, that the impact of these joint programs, it decreases design diversity, it suboptimizes mission, and it narrows the aerospace industrial base through that consolidation. The F-111 is just one example of the adverse consequences these kinds of programs can have on the military and on the industrial base. And furthermore, analysis has also shown that joint aircraft programs never yield, or they have not yielded, the intended cost-saving benefits. RAND did a really interesting study where they looked at joint development aircraft programs, and they found that if you took that program through 10 years of fielding, it was basically 20% more expensive for the joint program than to develop and field, sustain, and operate 3 separate fighter types or aircraft types.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant number. And we had mentioned before that periods of rapid technological change actually lowers the barriers of entry to new companies who want to get into the business, because everyone's having to learn something new, right? So this creates the opportunity for smaller, less established companies to mature and grow. But the Air Force and the department have to make that decision to mature and grow these new companies through robust research and development programs. So the Air Force should expand the number of credible majors to the defense industry by using these emerging technologies, like we said, hypersonics, space, some of these advanced information architectures, autonomous systems, through competitive prototyping programs. Remember, Have Blue, YF-16, YF-17. So these are ways that we can really focus on specific problems or areas that we think will provide an advantage, and we can do that in a way that helps diversify and builds up the industrial base. These programs can provide the challenges and the repetitions needed to create that innovation experience and maturity for those newer entrants. And they can also keep the engineering and manufacturing teams on established companies sharp. Like I said, much like the lightweight fighter program or the stealth programs, we can do this to mature critical technologies for rapid fielding.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you think about, like you said, there were 30 aircraft manufacturing companies. So when there's a competition, there's a lot of folks out there that could compete. If I'm a new startup, working a new idea out of my, the proverbial garage, where do you see these types of companies and ideas having opportunity for the Air Force?
Well, to take the unmanned systems, you saw General Atomics, you saw Kratos. So these are really interesting things that we're already beginning to see that, and we need to continue to support them and accelerate that. As I said, autonomous aircraft teaming is one obvious choice, but other areas that we need is advanced engine technologies, right? We've really come down to where Pratt & Whitney is the primary military engine provider. We need to make sure that we enable alternate engines to come back into the fold, so Rolls-Royce, GE, so forth. So advanced engine technologies, but also shaping, control systems, advanced materials. And finally, this isn't really sexy, but we need to de-risk modular system architectures on aircraft. And what I mean by that is, how can we rapidly change and integrate an aircraft sensors and avionics configuration in the same way that we change up weapons loadouts, right? So it's really about the sensors and the avionics that we have on an aircraft and how quickly we can modify those, maybe even out in the field. So that's going to require some of the savvy software integration skills that we talked about, so we can have the effective information fusion without the super tight coupling that drags down and inserts time and complexity into modernization programs. So industry's already shaped itself as prime integrators, and we can leverage their skill sets to advance this kind of capability.
Well, you've obviously thought of a bunch of neat opportunities. What else did you find in your studies?
Well, to really kind of get to what I think is probably the biggest thing that we need to reshape is shifting industry's profit centers away from sustainment and back into development and production. It's one thing to explore and experiment, but the Air Force has to hold actual competitions and buy actual production of airplanes. And the other thing is it can't keep them forever. The notion that we've had, that the average age of fighters is 30 years, that we're looking at keeping the F-35 for 70, that really is going to put a lid on our ability to field, to produce and field new aircraft. We know that aircraft have a chronological sustainment curve, regardless of their planned flight hour lifespan. Because as you know, most fighters, most aircraft, you count their lifespan in terms of how many flying hours or how many cycles they have. Their actual age matters too. And for fighters, they reach maximum affordability between 5 and 15 years. At 15 years, fighter sustainment costs begin to creep up, and at 20 years, they really require invasive work to keep them flying. So that already suggested a replacement time frame. And I know that airlift and bombers and other types of aircraft, they'll have a slightly different timeline, but we need to honor again that there's a chronological element to aircraft lifespan that we need to manage if we want them to be sustainable and affordable. You also need to couple that with the pace that technology changes today, right? It doesn't make sense to keep aircraft any longer than their sort of chronological lifespan anyways, because we also have to deal with the computer processors that are no longer manufactured, potentially dead software languages. There's elements of aircraft that deep in their guts that are core to their structure and core to their capabilities that, become victims to Moore's Law. And you just simply can't either replace them because no one's building, those sensors anymore. No one's building those chips anymore. And we get to a point where you have so much technical debt that it just makes better sense to replace these aircraft with fresh technology. We also know that there are minimum fleet quantities that you need to have to be sustainable and operationally relevant. And I'll spare you the math and everything that goes into it, but the smallest fleet you really want is 275. 250 is the absolute minimum, and 300 is really where you start to make a small fleet most viable. And this is because you have to deal with test aircraft, training aircraft. You're going to need to have a little bit of pad to allow some aircraft to be down for maintenance. But note that this small force doesn't really give you any kind of pad for combat or accident attrition, right? But with this force management concept, you want to get that out there as quickly as possible, which means completing that buy in 6 to 10 years max. And this implies rates of production between 36 and 60 aircraft a year. Now, this math is for fighters, and as I mentioned before, with the sort of the chronology, bombers and airlift and other mission aircraft have different timelines. But we need to change how we manage and refresh those fleets too. It's ridiculous that we're still flying aircraft bought in the Eisenhower administration and that 4 generations of pilots could have flown the same tail. Like, that's airshow cool, but that's not combat cool.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like Will Roper's Digital Century series.
Well, yeah. There's a lot of emotional baggage surrounding that, right? Yes and no. Roper's numbers were not operationally viable, and I think that just the math that I put you through regarding 275 with really kind of the sweet spot being at about 300 already shows the difference between what we're conceptualizing based off of, like I said, the math as well as history, and the other important thing is that Roper's numbers didn't provide the right incentives to industry. I liked his timeline of holding competitive prototyping programs about every 5 years. I believe we need a much more diverse fleet because that provides a strategic hedging, and we need 2 hotlines for resiliency. One thing that matters in this concept as we're looking forward to really shift away from sustainment and back into development production is to ensure that incumbents also don't dominate the prototyping, that they don't dominate production. And that should be avoided by not treating each cycle like it's just a model series upgrade. We really need to be filling out the complementary portfolio to offset attributes. But we need to be focused on speed to field. Again, this is about time as the offset, adaptation as the advantage. We can get back to 5-year timelines through a competitive experimental prototyping, which decreases risk, focusing programs on a small set of improved attributes, and enabling teams to make better design decisions and trade-offs by providing them clarity in the mission, and maximizing the use of mature and common subsystems.
Well, Heather, in all your research, are there any other lessons from the aircraft that we reviewed today that we need to look at?
Well, there's so much more that we could talk about. competitive prototyping, the de-scoping and technological reach, being open to unsolicited proposals, which we didn't really talk about, ensuring that additional competition opportunities are within reach. For example, a lot of companies would lose a competition, but then they'd take that design and they would iterate on it. They would learn from that, and they did that with their own money because they knew that there was another competition opportunity within reach. The government needs to be very disciplined about program stability. And there's some more granular stuff like, concurrency doesn't pay. But digital engineering may blur that lesson a little bit. When I say concurrency, what I'm referring to is building the production tooling and building the aircraft while we're still developing the aircraft. And historically, we've seen that actually increases cost and delays fielding of the final aircraft. So digital engineering may blur that lesson a little, but we're proving out that approach still. And so I remain optimistic but skeptical about how quickly digital engineering will allow us to move forward. But we need to pursue that to see if that's something that can get us even faster. I think mission systems are open enough to be flexible and adaptable, and that's a major lesson that I don't think anyone really appreciated until recently when we realized that we needed to have the advantage of fused information systems, but that kind of tight integration and coupling, really slows down the modernization and the developmental process. And finally, no future joint programs.
Gotcha. Well, let's wrap this up with one last question. What was your favorite jet of the series?
Oh, gosh. Like any good pilot, I'll say every single one, right? It's like, what's your favorite aircraft, the one that you're flying today?
Sure.
I mean, clearly, like the F-16 has a special place in my heart. But, I think historically speaking, I'd have to go for the F-105 for the thud. It was just a real powerful fighter. And, man, it could go. What about you? What was your favorite fighter?
Well, I have to say the F-100 for me. And I think, obviously just influenced by reading John Boyd's book and just thinking about single engine, single seat, single tail. I think they said the best combination of man and machine ever derived or something like that. But I think for me, that airplane has a special place also because I think the time frame coming out of Korea, and that's where really tactics development and me being a weapons school guy, I think the F-100 squadron out at Nellis really dove into tactics, techniques, procedures, and really, getting out there and bending airplanes. I mean, literally going out there, flying these jets really hard, bending them to see what they could get out of them, and then develop, better tactics for air crews to go out there and crush the enemy. So that's mine.
Yeah, no, I did F-100. It was at the top of my list too.
Awesome. Well, again, Heather, thanks so much for being here with us today. I know we took what we initially said was a dry subject, and you really put a lot of panache on it because I learned a lot personally listening to you, and I'm so thankful that you're doing the hard work, and you called it the creep work of deep diving into this, but it's just so important for us to understand as Americans and to keep air and space power going.
Well, thanks, Slick. It's great to be here. Look forward to next time.
With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you've heard today, don't forget to hammer down on that like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment for us to let us know what you think about our show or areas you would like to hear more about. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Until next time, this is John Slickbaum. Stay safe, check 6.